Years before I fell in love with Tomb Raider, I was captivated by a different game. The first video game I was ever exposed to, in fact. The name of it was Prince of Persia, and it's probably one of the most influential video games of all time. It's a surprisingly cinematic video game with an exciting plot, cutscenes, and rotoscoped animation that made it feel really unique back in 1989. It's also one of the most ported games ever, and while the Apple II version is the original, I grew up with the DOS version from 1990. Some of the ports are superior to the DOS version in terms of graphics, but none of them play as well, and since the precision of the controls is a huge part of why Prince of Persia is such a good game, that's a very bad thing. The exception is the splendid Super Nintendo port, but that version has so many changes that it's more of a remaster or a sequel even than a port. If you want to learn more about this multitude of different Prince of Persia ports, I recommend you to go watch David X. Newton's excellent videos about them. I've put links to them in the description down below. Now, Prince of Persia is a very scary and difficult game for a child, so at first I only had the courage to watch my mom play it. In the years that followed, however, I kind of grew up with this game, but I never actually completed it. With a new year comes new resolutions, and one of mine was to finally complete Prince of Persia, which I have now done. So now I want to tell you about it. The game begins with the eponymous prince being thrown into the dungeons beneath the palace, and you immediately wonder, why does this Persian prince look like George friggin' Stobart? The second thing you'll notice is that there's a reminder of how much time you have to complete the game. That's right, 60 minutes. 1 hour or the princess will be forced to marry Jafar. Or die. This is incredibly stressful, as Prince of Persia is a realistic platformer with a protagonist that must be carefully maneuvered and bunny hopped through 12 levels full of dangers and fever dream-like architecture. Unlike the Marios and Mega Mans of that era, the prince doesn't have gravity-defying jumps. In other words, he moves like an actual human. His jumps must be timed in accordance with the grid the floor is laid out on, since he won't jump the moment you press the button. Likewise, the prince will take damage or even die from high drops, so instead he must be lowered into a hanging position before he can drop to safety when the drop is high. None of this is ideal when you are in a race against time to save the love of your life, but it's also a huge part of why the game is so immersive. Once the prince escapes his prison cell, he'll soon stand face to face with one of the flamboyantly dressed guards, but with no weapon to defend himself, it's a rather one-sided fight. Instead, the prince must head all the way to the left through timed gates and crumbling floor tiles to grab a sword next to a skeleton. The prince can now engage in sword fights against these Adolf Hitler-looking guards, and rather surprisingly perhaps, the game has somewhat deep combat. The prince can block, stab, and even switch position with the enemy. Once the guard has been defeated, the prince can advance to the next level. Meanwhile, the princess is anxiously awaiting her savior. Like any good level 2, the second level of Prince of Persia is basically just more of everything the first level had to offer, but harder. There's a scary moment where the prince must drop down in front of a guard with a high drop just behind him, which makes the time the prince takes to withdraw his sword nerve-wracking. Level 2 introduces red health potions that recover 1 point of lost health, as well as devious blue poison potions that will take away 1 point of health. More importantly, the level introduces large red potions, which permanently extends the prince's health bar. Prince of Persia is full of secret little areas that often are hidden above faulty ceiling tiles. This hilariously makes you want to go and poke the ceiling everywhere in order to find them all. Level 3 is where things go a little crazy. As if the spike traps aren't bad enough, the prince now has to deal with these absolutely terrifying choppers. They must be passed with the utmost care, or the prince will suffer a violent death that's surprisingly graphic considering the amount of pixels that are involved. Oh, the joy when there's 3 of them! On his way to unlock the level's exit, the prince passes a skeleton, and when he runs back to reach that exit, it rises from the dead to challenge him to a sword fight. Since you can't kill something that's already dead, the skeleton must instead be dealt with by being pushed off the edge. This is the only way to move past it and finally reach that exit. Meanwhile, the princess has decided to lay down a bit. Oh, isn't that nice? The prince is putting his life on the line to come and save her, and she's bored. Level 4 is the first level set in the actual palace, and the change of scenery is very welcome. The palace is beautifully decorated, and it's considerably nicer to explore than the creepy dungeons. The level has the perhaps most iconic moment of the game, where the prince's path is suddenly blocked by a mirror. A running jump through the mirror will get the prince past it, but it will also release the reflection of the prince, which has its own will and motivations. This douchebag reflection shows up again in level 5, where it snatches and empties one of the rare big health potions before the prince can even get to it. Meanwhile, the princess has decided to stand up again. Good for her. Level 6 is very short, but it's one of the most memorable levels in the game. First up is a boss fight against the largest man in Persia, who is surprisingly quick considering that rotund frame of his. Next, there's a balcony with a beautiful view of the starlit night sky, which makes you think that you might have done it. Since these levels seemingly come in threes, you expect the next screen to be the princess's bedroom, but instead the prince will stand face to face with his own reflection again. Well, there's a deep chasm in between, and when the prince leaps across it to grab onto the ledge, the reflection shows its true colors and sends the prince back to the dungeons. Level 7 begins with the prince falling to his death, so a ledge must immediately be grabbed to save his life. A mysterious large green potion can be seen on the other side, which is the key to complete this level. Several traps and guards later, the prince arrives at this potion, which lets him fall through the air like a feather and lands safely on the ground next to the exit. Meanwhile, the princess is talking to a mouse. Jesus, it's only been like half an hour or so. Pull yourself together, princess. Level 8 is where all of my childhood attempts at beating the game usually ended. Right off the bat, it has the game's most difficult combat encounter, as this guard has a more advanced attack and defense pattern. Once you finally figure him out, it's satisfying to send him off the edge into the spike pit down below. Another reason why this level is so hard is that there's a long and tricky timed gate puzzle that requires near-perfect platforming. Thankfully, the princess's pet mouse shows up and opens a gate for the prince if you screw up, so I guess she actually can talk to mice. The mouse is rewarded with a little treat. In comparison to the nightmare that was level 8, level 9 is a breeze, even if it might be the longest level. There's another green potion here, but this one flips the screen upside down. This makes navigation surprisingly confusing and difficult, but thankfully it's over quickly. Following the 3 arguably longest and hardest levels in the game, the prince is back in the palace for level 10 and 11, which thankfully are both shorter and easier. I began the final level of the game with only 5 minutes left on the clock. My heart was pounding through my chest here with so little time to finally complete the game after all these years. First, that rope reflection must be dealt with. The prince must put away his sword and simply merge with it. At the end of the level, that bastard Jafar awaits. I only had a few seconds left on my clock at this point, so that made the prospect of fighting this intimidating foe even more stressful. Thankfully, a little switch and a push will do the trick quickly. I finally did it, and without a second to spare. With Jafar dead, the prince and the princess embrace and live happily ever after. With their pet mouse. Prince of Persia pushed the boundaries of video games in 1989 and was a huge success that got its own sequel a few years later. The game basically invented a new genre of cinematic platformers with games such as Another World, Flashback, Blackthorn, Nosferatu, Oddworld, and Heart of Darkness. A bunch of shameless knockoffs arrived to cash in on the success as well, such as the bizarre Cruel World and a stupid Zorro game. But much more importantly, Prince of Persia paved the way for a certain dual pistol wielding Tomb Raiding adventurer. In my opinion, Prince of Persia's influence on the classic Tomb Raider games is as clear as day. Both the prince and Lara can be maneuvered carefully by holding down a walk button, which will prevent them from walking off the edge of platforms. They both take damage from high drops, and they'll both die from very high drops. Both games have grid-based levels and running jumps that must be timed a few steps ahead. Both the prince and Lara can grab onto ledges from which they can pull themselves up. And besides running jumps, both characters have a standing jump as well as a standing forward jump. Both the prince and Lara can withdraw and holster the weapon, and they both need to physically pick up items as opposed to just walking over them, which seemed to be the standard back then. They must also both deal with a tricky doppelganger situation, undead skeleton warrior enemies, horrifying nasty choppers, crumbling floor tiles, and, of course, spike pits. And both the prince and Lara can be safely maneuvered through these spikes by holding down the walk button. Prince of Persia basically paved the way so Tomb Raider could arrive and shine 7 years later. In a rather ironic twist of fate, the Tomb Raider games would in turn inspire a new era of 3D Prince of Persia games such as the lackluster Prince of Persia 3D from 1999. In 2003, however, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time released to great critical acclaim, and that in turn inspired the next generation of Tomb Raider games developed by Crystal Dynamics. At least I think so. Nowadays, the Prince of Persia franchise belongs to Ubisoft and has seemingly been put in the grave with 13 years having passed since the latest main series release. Some would probably argue that the Prince of Persia series evolved into the Assassin's Creed series, which is still going strong to this very day. There's reportedly a remake of The Sands of Time in the works, but it has had a very troubled development with several delays, so who knows. One thing is for sure, the original Prince of Persia is an amazing game, and I'll never forget the impact it had on me at a very young age. This was where my love for video games began.